This plane was the perfect anti to its own story because it was so all over the place that reading it feels like you're teleporting. When most people think of the US Navy in World War II, there are usually a few planes that come to mind. The Hellcat, the Corsair, the Dauntless. But almost always towards the bottom of the list of memorables is usually this guy, the F4F Wildcat. This barrel with wings was the first of the Grumman feline family line, and while it wasn't as sleek as most of its peers, it was exactly the rock the Navy needed to build its carrier-borne church. It was durable, it was decently quick, and it did its best work when it embodied the idea of less is more, and all of that made a plane that did better than history typically remembers. Which is a statement I make because the Wildcat would end up being so all over the Earth's waters that you could have mistaken it for Schrodinger's cat, because it would be everywhere and nowhere in the war all at once, fighting anyone and anything it could get its hands on from theater to Axis theater.
I'm everywhere, and yet nowhere.
Whether it was fighting the Germans or the Japanese and their fighters, bombers, infantry, or even submarines, this plane, which was rebuilt from a biplane, would get the job done time and time again. Throwback to 1935, the Great Depression is only starting to ease up, civil aviation is a budding field, and the monoplane or single-wing design is just beginning to seal the biplane away in history. And the Navy was probably looking at the pace of aviation technology, then back at their Grumman F4F biplanes, then back at the tech, then back at the biplanes, and went,
"Can you go any faster?"
Because while two wings might mean more lift, they also mean more drag. See, every wing you come across produces these vortexes of air at the wingtips as a result of producing lift, hence the name of wingtip vortices. However, these vortices also produce a metric ton of drag. Roughly 40% of all drag force on an airplane comes from these flying fidget spinners on the ends. And so if you have twice the wing, guess what you do to the drag?
Double it!
And since any fighter pilot knows that speed is life, they can also do the math that a faster plane means a faster win, and well, here in America, we like winning. So in April, the Navy would request proposals for a new fighter to replace that F3F. And since Leroy Grumman and his team made the F3F, and the F2F before that, and the FF before that, you get what I'm saying. They are the heavyweight champion of naval fighters at the time, so you can bet your bullets they're coming back to defend their title. And in March 1936, Grumman and his team would present their defense in the form of the Model 16, Navy designated the XF4F1. This biplane design was an improved version of the F3F, but it was also the only biplane submitted. Seversky had submitted a navalized P-35 known as the XFNF1, and Brewster was stepping into the ring with their first ever fighter design, the XF2A1.
The legend, the runner-up, and the rookie. 3 cars, 1 champion.
These designs would be all sized up on June 22nd, 1936, and different sources have conflicting details on what happened next. We know that Seversky's design was too slow, so the Navy took that proposal out back and executed it, which is impressive because one dude showed up with a biplane which is supposed to be slower, and they still lost. It's like getting beaten in a race by the class nerd. So the real mess comes from figuring out what happened between Grumman and Brewster. One source says that the Navy sent it back that same summer like hotter but not quite, try again, and requested that Grumman build a monoplane while they chose the Brewster design instead. Another says that while the Navy ordered a prototype of the XF4F1, Grumman had the foresight to see monoplanes as the future of aviation and persuaded the Navy to give up on developing the prototype they had just contracted. But if you look at the timeline, it's clearly a combination of these. My estimate is that the Navy awarded prototype contracts to both Grumman and Brewster, with Brewster being new to fighter design being the primary recipient, and Grumman, the old reliable, being the backup. But Grumman had other plans because they most likely saw Brewster's monoplane submission and went, "Write that down, write that down!" before convincing the Navy that he could do it better and getting permission to use the contract funding to completely redesign the F4F into a monoplane. This would manifest as the Model 18, or the XF4F2, which would be the first of the F4F designs to fly in September 1937. The plane would show off a speed of 288 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, or 463 knot miles an hour at 3,000 knot feet, but it also had numerous issues, one of which eventually forced the prototype to make an unpowered and gliding or dead stick landing that eventually flipped the plane. Because of these issues, the fact that Grumman had other existing production contracts still in place, and the Navy's general desire to just have more options for contractors, on June 11, 1938, the Navy would order the Brewster F2A Buffalo as their first monoplane fighter. And that's where the story ends, right? Wrong.
But I'm not done yet.
Grumman was as resilient as the metal his company shaped, and you know what they say, third time's the charm. The plane they were about to make would earn them the nickname of the Grumman Iron Works, which was appropriate for the group of iron souls that were about to make it. They would reshape the Model 18 yet again into the Model 36, reshaping the fuselage, lengthening the wings by 2 feet on each side, and squaring the surfaces to squeeze as much lift as they could out of the profile. But most importantly, they upgraded the Dash 66 version of the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, the original one, to the Dash 76 upgrade of the 14-cylinder twin-row radial engine, which added a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger to make high altitudes feel like lower altitudes. That meant that the engine would take in and combust more air higher up than it otherwise could, producing more power and performance at the cost of fuel economy. Basically, they put the Wildcat on altitudinal steroids so it could jump up to the top rope before coming down and elbow-dropping somebody back down to earth. And with global tensions growing and the F4F Buffalo production being too slow and problematic to keep up, who would have guessed that the rookie fighter company would have problems? The Navy opted for Plan B. They would order a prototype of the XF4F-3 in October 1938, which would finally take to the skies on February 12, 1939. After showing off a top speed of 335 miles an hour at 21,300 feet or 529 knot miles an hour at 6.5 kilometers, and getting a few tweaks for cooling and stability purposes, the Navy would order the F4F-3 into production on August 8, 1939 with a buy-in of 54 planes. And the first of these production aircraft would see the sky in February 1940 before entering service with the Navy that year. And much like its development cycle, the F4F-3 stat card was also this rough organization of various ups and downs. It was kind of all over the place. Everywhere and nowhere, if you will. It was already filling out most of its potential, but it did need some work in a few areas, like going on a diet. The Wildcat was always a bit big-boned and clocked in at a maximum weight of roughly 6,900 pounds or 3,100 knot-pounds. And that was without folding wing mechanisms or most of its pilot protection. It already had self-sealing fuel tanks and cockpit glass, but a lot of the armor plating, including the seatback protection, wouldn't be added until 1942. And when they were added, that would only place even more strain on the 1,200 horsepower engine, which only produced that much on takeoff and was limited to 1050 at altitude. As a result of that, the Wildcat would hit a max speed of 330 miles an hour at 19,000 feet or 530 knot miles an hour at 5,800 knot feet, slightly slower than what Grumman had promised. And while 330 miles an hour was nowhere near its cruising speed at that altitude, it was still pretty good for the time. And the plane got even better when you got to firepower. The Wildcat came stock with 4 of the patron saint of hole-punching signature 50 cals and 400 rounds apiece. Although on early models, these fired through the propeller instead of around it. And when they changed that later, since the wings weren't made to house the guns from the start, they would jam more easily. They also didn't get reflector gun sights until 1941, so they were originally stuck aiming their guns like a pirate captain. And getting out there to shoot the bad guys was also a problem. While the Wildcat did have a max of 147 gallons or 556 liters of gas on board and a maximum range of 880 miles or 1280 knot miles, that was only possible on ferry flights, and it normally carried only 110 gallons or 416 liters. That meant, at most, it could only make a 175-mile round trip to reach out and turn someone into a temporary island. And if they weren't careful with a range that short, they would become that temporary island instead, so it was great that they came with the ZB homing half of the YEZB Hayrake radio navigation system that the Navy installed on carrier planes to help make it back to their carriers. America would then face-plant its way into the Wildcat's teething process when they took it out for its operational debut in the Atlantic. There, it protected American shipping from U-boat attacks in those neutrality patrols, aka America double-daring the Germans to touch their boats and find out the hard way who's winning the race to the sun. No questions, just take a number and wait for your turn in line to figure the out what you wished for. But they had a hell of a time adjusting to it because, remember, this is only America's second naval fighter with one set of wings ever, and for most of their pilots, it was their first. Like I said, who'd have guessed that the rookie would have problems, and the F4F Buffalo ended up having so many problems that the Navy and Marines had to pull out the Uno reverse card and start switching it out for the very plane that it beat in trials. Translation, they're about to find out what happens when the plane is the frickin' new guy. And that wasn't all sunshine and rainbows either, because pilots had to get used to landing a lot faster than both they and the manufacturer had expected. Think of it like flying down the highway and riding a guardrail around the corner to pass somebody. It takes some wild kind of talent to get that right on the first try and not hit something you shouldn't. The Brits would end up having more luck. Pilots of the Fleet Air Arm were already operating the Rock and were more familiar with leaving the second set of wings at home, so they had a little less trouble landing in a hurry. The only real issue they'd have with landing was adjusting to the narrow wheelbase they lowered like an old car window with 28 hand-cranked cycles around a wheel in the cockpit. But their first experience with these aircraft wouldn't come from their own orders. It would come from the ones made for the French. France had ordered 100 G-36As, as they called them, in anticipation of the German invasion, which had a few tweaks from the Star-Spangled setup.
You pour the f***ing French coffee in your engine and it works better.
These coffee-driven models had 6 French 7.65mm machine guns instead of the 450s, and a 1,200 horsepower 9-cylinder Wright R1820 Cyclone single-row radial engine with a single-stage supercharger. However, while the first of them saw the sky on May 10, 1940, France would be forcibly converted to the spawn point for all their surrender memes on June 23rd, and they wouldn't be able to take the order. So these Wildcats are about to be blue-balled out of the fight when Britain swoops in. Just as most people would never jump out of a perfectly good airplane, Britain saw no sense in throwing out a perfectly good airplane, so they would take the order instead for the Fleet Air Arm. These Martlet 1s, as they called them, would have the American guns reinstalled before the 91 produced were renamed, fitted with reflector gun sights, and sent to Canada. A U-boat attack would cost them 10 more on their way to Britain, but in yet another shuffle of fate's deck, the first of the now 81 Martlets would arrive on July 27, 1940, 1 month before the Navy got their first F4F 3s. However, the first impressions proved to be at least a little annoying, because the Martlet 1s had enough red flags to make the Brits pray they could ghost their German dates. Aside from the initial lack of armor and the speed being lower than advertised, opening the canopy in flight would make you think God turned on his vacuum and that canopy was stuck to the plane so you couldn't just throw it away to get out. Plus, the engine boost was completely manual and required a pilot's near undivided attention to use, usually in the middle of a fight. Changing to 50 cal gun mounts from the 7.65s also gave the forever problem of jamming like a rock band, and just sitting in the cockpit was a carbon monoxide risk.
Oh, and this is just your first form?
And yet, despite these flaws, it was still the most advanced option readily available. The primary alternative was navalizing the Hurricanes into Sea Hurricanes, but the RAF needed all of those they could spare. Plus, these Martlet 1s were still competent fighters if expertly managed, and on Christmas Day of 1940, 2 Martlets from 804th Squadron would get their new plane a historic gift, scoring its first blood when they downed a German Junkers Ju-88 bomber over Scapa Flow in Scotland. And 'twas the season to be merry and bring the Christmas cheer to all, so Grumman would receive one of the coolest war trophies ever when the RAF mailed them one of the bomber's wooden propellers.
You got me a present?
So despite the early birds' first impression leaving a bad taste in their lifespan at times, the Brits didn't walk away from the Martlet. Instead, that summer of 1940, they would order an improved variant based on all that feedback called the Martlet II, with the most notable difference being the addition of 2 more 50 cals. Though to balance the weight, they had to cut down the total ammo pool to 230 rounds a gun. The RAA originally ordered 100 planes, but then they learned that Grumman was coming up with their own folding wing design, which could fit the Wildcat into half the space it normally needed. The Brits realized this meant they could shove the Martlets onto their planned escort carriers, not just the illustrious class, and they willingly delayed the last 90 planes on the contract so they could get the Wing Compactor 9000 fitted, and the first 9 had them put on afterwards. And to answer the question, I don't know if number 10 was lost, if it crashed, or if it got shot down during its fight over the Mediterranean Sea. Over in the Mediterranean, the Brits were really excited to receive their new planes. In the words of the Fleet Air Arm Test and Evaluation pilot for the Martlet, Captain Eric Brown, since the war began, we'd been making do with the old Gladiators and the bumbling Rocks when the RAF had Hurricanes and Spitfires. We had to fight Me-109s and Reggianis with our old weapons, and we'd lost far too many good men. But now, America was sending Britain the sinews of war and the Lend-Lease Agreement, and we in 802 were licking our lips in anticipation of a new fighter built especially for high-performance carrier flying by the excellent firm of Grumman. She was called the Wildcat in America and the Martlet in Britain. She was a monoplane, she was fast, and she had big half-inch machine guns. We just couldn't wait.
Let's go.
But while the Brits were dancing in the skies over the Mediterranean off the HMS Formidable, the big producer across the pond was starting to worry. There were some concerns that the US might run short on two-stage superchargers, leading officials to request single-stage alternatives for anything that didn't already use one. As a result, the Navy would pick up 95 F4F 3A Wildcats, which fit that bill. However, half the supercharger means half the power boost, and of course that made US pilots hate it compared to the original. So they were probably pretty happy when Greece monetarily volunteered to take 30 of them off their hands on May 8th, 1940 to add to their collection of tactically acquired toys for kicking Italy right in the meatballs. But these aircraft would also be blueballed out of taste testing some new Allied cuisine and diverted to the British after they were shipped, this time as the Martlet III, because then the Germans conquered the Greeks in 2 weeks flat and they surrendered on April 20th, 1941.
Oh, come on, seriously!
But the Martlet's attention would stay over the Mediterranean Sea, and in July 1941, Martlet IIs would be sent out aboard the HMS Audacity to test out the concept of the escort carrier. And I know I've brought up those last two words a few times now, but it's kind of important to understand what they are. An escort carrier is to a main carrier or fleet carrier what the Chaffee was to a Sherman tank. It was lighter, it was smaller, it didn't have as much room for boom, and if it was caught fighting on the front lines, then somebody was either getting a medal or a court-martial. Basically, they strapped a flight deck and an aircraft hangar to a merchant ship, threw on a bunch of airplanes, and said, "Go fetch." These were more for secondary roles than frontline fights, such as close air support, guarding shipping, and sinking subs. Think of them as the OG flavor of the mini carriers used by the Marine Expeditionary units today, except instead of being first in the door, they're last. They're kind of like the Navy's janitorial staff for cleaning the enemy's spots off their maps. They're vitally important and rarely given their deserved recognition. And the biggest limiting factor these British janitors had to worry about was limiting Martlet patrols to 2 hours instead of the 4.5 max it could pull, because they had to leave behind at least 20 minutes of reserves in case the pilots had to abort the landing. And that might sound like a lot of gas for a go-around, but remember, part of their responsibilities was anti-submarine warfare, and you're in U-boat territory, so sailing in a straight line to receive carrier-based landings makes you a pretty nice sitting duck for a torpedo. But of course, the question that comes to everyone's mind is, but how did it do against everyone else? Well, it was a mixed bag. Interestingly, one Fleet Air Arm pilot named Henry Hank Adlam decided to test his Martlet, which was equipped with 650 cals and therefore either a Martlet 2, 3, or 4, against a friend of his named Bruce, who was flying a Seafire Mark II-C. They had both a mock dogfight and a race, and as weird as it sounds, the Martlet could keep up with the Seafire, even despite the fact that Bruce was a far superior pilot to Hank. While the Martlet was slower than the Seafire, it was only that way by less than 10 knots, and while climbing was out of the question, it could apparently outturn the navalized Spitfire. In Adlam's experience, the Wildcat actually had more trouble fighting the Sea Hurricane Mark II-Cs than the Seafire Mark II-Cs, although the Martlet was faster. But the FAA would soon learn that even the new Martlets would have their hands full with German fighters. The Bf-109Fs and Gs may have had a lighter weight of fire than the Martlets, but they were faster than hitting like, comment, and subscribe, and they could fly circles around the Brits upstairs. They could only put up a fight down low, which then gave the Germans the first shot, which could be deadly. But at least they had a chance against the 109s because the Shrikes were a whole different ballgame. Because if the Martlets got matched up against the Butcher Birds, they would start hearing boss music before seeing a pop-up in front of their faces looking like the ending of Halo Reach.
Current objective.
Survive.
The FW-190A4s earned their nickname even against the later model Martlets, because while the Allied plane could outturn him, there was a lag of 120 degrees of turn before the Martlet could actually actually escape the Shrike's sting. And that was the only edge it got. It was outclassed in every other metric: speed, firepower, and general protection. Even if the FW-190 was flying in the fighter-bomber role, the most the Martlet could do was force him to ditch his bombs early before an easy fight.
My speed, my stamina, my power all rival. Nay, dwarf yours. In comparison to you, I am a demigod.
But despite these unfair type matchups, the escort carrier concept worked out just fine. At least for the first deployment, because a U-boat would sink it on the second one 5 days before Christmas. Worst Christmas ever. And speaking of December 1941, here comes my favorite boy. Pearl Harbor did not earn the Wildcats' reputation any bonus points. The squadron of Marine Corps Wildcats stationed at Pearl had split their forces down the middle between there and Wake Island 2 weeks prior, and so when the Japanese came knocking, 9 out of 11 Wildcats would be knocked out. And unlike the P-40, none of them were noted as getting airborne or getting kills. The Marines at Wake Island would suffer the same fate as their Pearl Harbor kin, but not before setting America's tone for the entire war. Despite 8 of their 12 planes being blown up on the ground, the 4 that survived would absolutely drop-kick the Japanese. 2 cruisers and 2 transport ships were damaged by the F4F's 50 cals and 100-pound bombs, but what's more impressive were the ones they sank. One Japanese submarine had the audacity to surface only 25 miles off the atoll coast, which the Marines rewarded by making it part of the atoll coast. Then there was Captain Henry T. Elrod, who sank the destroyer Kisaragi by dropping a 100-pound bomb into the destroyer's depth charge storage.
Shot of the century right there. Nice.
And I need to pause to get you to understand how ridiculous that is. An American 100-pound bomb from World War II is less than 2 inches longer than a football. The one that goes in your hands, not on your feet. That one's called a soccer ball, and I will fight about it. Captain Elrod took that explosive football and parked it just right in the end zone for the most explosive field goal in history. Because sometimes it really is about how you use the size instead of the size itself. Add that to 21 Japanese planes shot down, and those 4 Wildcats racked up one hell of a kill total before the Japanese captured the pilots and the bombed out wreckage. But when it was time to replace those planes, that loss turned into a gain because the Wildcats got an upgrade. Or a downgrade, depending on how you look at it.
It's a matter of perspective, really.
First flown back on April 15, 1941, the F4F Wildcats would replace the F4F3s on the production line by the spring of 1942. 1,168 were built, and 220 of them would become the first Lend-Leased variant as the Martlet IV. This plane got the armor and gun sight stock, plus the folding wings that Grumman had been working on, and at the base of those wings, it got new hardpoints for external fuel tanks. The Dash 4 could be piped for up to 2 tanks of either the 58-gallon or 42-gallon variety, although it was more common for them to piss off everyone with OCD and pick up a combat loadout of only 1 42 mounted asymmetrically under the right wing. However, while this did replace the 3 gallons of max capacity the Dash 4 had lost to fit the folding wings, the combat radius only saw a marginal increase from its original 175 miles to 200 with the tank equipped. Then they gave it the Martlet II's 6 guns, and its limited ammo, which left pilots with only 20 seconds of continuous fire. As the cardinal rule goes, less is more, and in this case, less guns means more bullets per gun. But because they forgot that, pilots with an itchy trigger finger would run out of ammo too quick, and even experienced pilots like the Marine Corps' ace of aces Joe Smokey Foss had to grapple with that limitation. Plus, all that weight meant a slower climb, which on a good day was roughly half of what was advertised.
Are you really trying to sell me that same box of crap?
That said, the new plane wouldn't see any massive fights at first, because by early 1942, the US still couldn't mass enough forces for proper full-tilt engagements in the Pacific. I mean, Pearl Harbor happened like 2 months ago. But they also weren't about to let the Japanese go wherever they pleased, so the Navy forces in the Pacific decided to make a bunch of hit-and-run attacks on Japanese bases, just to cause damage, problems, and mayhem wherever they could, generally harassing and grinding down the Japanese war machine. It was during these guerrilla tactics on February 20th, 1942, that Butch O'Hare would become the first Navy ace of World War II, when he got ace in a day by shooting down 5 Japanese bombers attacking the USS Lexington in a span of 4 minutes, while his wingman suffered the all-too-common gun jam and got stuck in the aerial cuck chair.
It should have been me!
Wildcats would first encounter their infamous nemesis, the Zero, at the Battle of Midway, where, to probably everyone's surprise, they achieved a 3-to-1 kill ratio against their superior high-performing rivals. Meanwhile, over in the Atlantic, the Wildcat would pick up a job as a submarine hunter along with its latest battle buddy, the TBM Avenger. The Wildcats would usually fly over to a surface U-boat and knock out the AA guns on board, which would either force it to call it quits on playtime or leave it exposed to the 3-man barrel full of enough explosives to send your conning tower to low orbit. And while that tag team duo would share credit for sinking no fewer than 27 U-boats, as well as participate in the capture of U-boat 505, none of what we've already said was what the Wildcat would come to be the most known for. After the spankings at the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the Japanese had lost so much air power output that it shifted the balance of naval power into America's favor. With more carriers left standing, America now had more say in what range a naval fight started at, and since offense is so heavily dependent on choosing when a battle begins, this forced the Japanese to put a pin in their previous naval aggression, breaking the momentum of their advance across the Pacific. So when America learned that Japan had nearly finished a runway on the island of Guadalcanal that threatened the supply lines to our old friend down under Australia, they immediately decided to weaponize that edge to pull the commie card and make it our runway. The enemy has nice things, congratulations, we're taking them away, give it here.
Does anyone else hear that?
Yeah, and it's getting closer. And it sounds an awful lot like...
Mine.
After seizing it with a surprise amphibious landing, the place was renamed Henderson Field, codenamed Cactus, and the Wildcats and Dauntlesses they flew in to use that runway were quickly nicknamed the Cactus Air Force. Naturally, the Japanese, being a bunch of sore losers at having their stuff taken fair and square, would begin landing troops and sending waves of planes to try and take it back, among which was, again, the A6M-0. This plane had gained so much notoriety since Midway that there were several pilots who misidentified their enemies as Zeros, and not without good reason. Pretty much all but the last models of Wildcats were at a disadvantage against them. The Zeros were lighter, faster, more agile, had heavier 20mm cannons, and a longer combat range. Turn fights were out of the question because even if you got behind a Zero, if you weren't an expert at managing stick and throttle, they'd say the Zero would be on you inside of 2 turns. So that left the Wildcat with pretty much 3 points to work with: durability, accuracy, and coordination. The Wildcats by this point had all of their armor and durability upgrades, while the Zeros had enough armor protection to equate to flying fucking firebombs.
Is it on fire?
It could be more on fire.
The Wildcat's armor also amounted to a heavier weight, which let it dive faster. If a Zero tried to keep up with it, its float carburetor could cause the engine to stall if they nosed over too fast or tried to fly inverted, and the high diving speeds would lock up their roll controls between 250 and 350 miles an hour. So the best mode of attack then became introducing the Zeros to the FitnessGram Pacer test, starting from the up position and going straight to down. And while surviving their own diving attack run wasn't guaranteed, the Wildcat actually had an ironic mystery advantage that would help them when later became now. They could shoot better in a turn. Unlike the American plane, the Zero used both 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons, 2 different gun calibers with 2 different ballistic arcs. Combine that with the reflector gun sights the Wild Kiddies got in 1941, and if a Zero pilot wasn't careful, those cats would come downstairs and teach them what it feels like to be divided by Zero. But the Wildcat's ultimate advantage had a lot less to do with it and a lot more with the information provided to it. See, unlike the Zeros, the Wildcats had radios, and the Pacific War saw the first development of the Navy's Combat Information Center, or a singular location that combined all the information about a battlefield to let a commanding officer make more informed decisions. Think of it like an early form of sensor fusion that could also take in info from the outside, such as the warnings sent out about aircraft leaving the nearby land base of Rabaul from the Australian Coast Watchers, a military intelligence network the Australians established to keep tabs on Japanese movements in the South Pacific. And the importance of these guys cannot be understated because the base model Wildcat, the Dash 3, took 7.6 minutes to climb to 20,000 feet, and almost every model after that took longer. The Zero actually had about the same time to climb to that altitude as the base Wildcat, so against the originals, and definitely against anything after that, the element of surprise would have been the most deciding factor in any engagement between the two, had the Coast Watchers not been risking their necks to get rid of it in the first place.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
If you're not picking up what I'm throwing out here, World War II was the first electronic information war, and the Allies weaponized the unholy hell out of it. Butch O'Hare wouldn't be the only ace in a day made by the Wildcat, just the fastest. During the Guadalcanal campaign, 2nd Lieutenant Jefferson LeBlanc would also score his first 5 kills on a single combat sortie and became an ace in a day, with less than 10 hours of flying time in the Wildcat itself. He would be shot down on that mission and captured by a hostile native tribe on the nearby islands, who then traded him to a tribe friendly to the US for a 10-pound bag of rice. Lieutenant James Sweat would also bag the ace in a day achievement over Guadalcanal during Japan's last-ditch offensive in early 1943, and Joe Smokey Foss would become the Marine Corps' highest-scoring ace with 25 kills during this campaign, all in the Wildcat, and 16 of which were against Zeros. And there were probably a few more aces in a day made by this plane that we might not know about, especially in the early years where the Japanese almost always outnumbered the Americans.
I call it a target-rich environment.
There was even an air-to-air melee kill made by an unknown pilot that we only know about because it had 2 witnesses. Chick Morris and Lieutenant Pat McEntee aboard the respective cruisers Helena and Lanta looked up during the Battle of Guadalcanal and watched as a Wildcat closed on a G4M1 Betty bomber from behind. This thing pulls up over the bomber's wing, drops its 28-cycle Circle Jerk 9000, then noses up and down, over and over again, hitting the bomber's wing repeatedly until it falls off, physically beating the wing off the Japanese plane.
I see an illuminated Doge face on Donkey Kong beating the meat off of me.
I need to know who that pilot was because that is the aerial equivalent of a shovel tag. But the Japanese weren't the only ones suffering losses, and if it weren't for the fact that Grumman was one of the most legendary backline companies, they might not have had enough replacements. Jake Swerble, one of Grumman's co-founders, convinced his team to come in on a weekend during the Guadalcanal campaign and put together 23 planes in 24 hours, almost a plane for every hour when the standard production rate had been 3 a day. And that was while processing all of the experimental versions they were still putting together as the skies of Guadalcanal were being lit up. Even before the South Pacific skies were being lit on fire, Grumman was still toying around with the Wildcat platform, like making 20 gunless recon versions called the F4F 7s. But by late 1942, Grumman had a bigger priority, the F6F Hellcat. And these things were like Daft Punk, harder, better, faster, stronger in every way, and Grumman needed all of its factory space to build them for the fleet. So the Navy ordered General Motors, back when they could build something for more than 100,000 miles, to take over the Wildcat. The first of these GM versions, the FM1, was basically the same as the F4F4, except it went back down to 450 cals and got 430 rounds per gun this time. 312 were built as the Martlet 5 for the Fleet Air Arm, and 748 were delivered for the US Navy. There was also a weird attempt in 1943 to put floats on an F4F3 for recon called the F4F3S Wildcat Fish, and that name was just as much of an abomination to the mouth as the plane was an abomination to the laws of physics. So while it could at least fly, it was so slow no one bothered to buy it. But the most popular version of the Wildcat still hadn't surfaced yet. That was the FM2, which first flew as the XF4F8 on November 12, 1942. And you might think by most popular, there were like 1,500 of them, 1,750, maybe 2,000 of them made. Nah, 4,777 of these were thrown out the GM factory doors and shoved onto the decks of escort carriers in 1943, with 370 going to the Brits as the Martlet 6. The Hellcats and Corsairs were too big and heavy for the smaller ships, so the Wildcats got a second lease on life as Uncle Sam's cleanup crew for whenever he missed a spot.
Hey, kid! You missed a spot!
And not only were they the most capable model, they finally fixed a lot of the Wildcat's standing issues. For one, it put on a taller vertical tail to patch out some of the bad spin characteristics that had been a problem the entire time. But the big one was finally fixing the power-to-weight ratio. Not only was this the first model to be made noticeably lighter, but the 450-pound weight loss got combined with a 150-horsepower gain from the uprated -56 version of the Wright R1820 Cyclone 9 9-cylinder single-row radial engine that had been put on the original French export models. These improved engines put out 1350 horses total, and with all that extra power, they finally had room for more fun stuff, like upgrading the underwing bombs from 100-pounders to 250-pounders and adding more gas, water methanol injection as a quick nitrous boost, and even 5-inch rocket racks throughout the production run.
Upgrades, people, upgrades. That's how we make the dough.
And it was this version that would see the Wildcats' most intense fighting in October 1944. Not against fighters, but in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 228 Wildcats launched from 16 escort carriers would be involved in the fighting off the coast of Samar. These Wildcats would fly against the Japanese Center Force, personally facing off against the battleship Yamato and her sister Mizashi, the second of which would bite well over 30 hits from bombs and torpedoes, dislodging armor panels and sinking her to the Pacific floor. Oh, and that reminds me, the Bismarck was the second largest class of oceanic paperweight. I forgot a word last time. It couldn't be the second largest period because the Yamato class ships take up the top 3 slots. My bad. Oops. But outside of this one naval engagement, most of 1944 and 45 were spent taking souls on the ground, using 5-inch rockets and bombs to provide fire support for the Marines taking back the Philippines and landing on Okinawa. The last of 7,251 Wildcats built were accepted into service in May 1945, with production ending that same month to make way for its final replacement, the F4F Bearcat. And when the war finally ended, the Navy did not hesitate to get rid of them. Most were put into storage or sold for surplus, leaving a lot of them alive to this day in the hands of museums and collectors. The reliable Wildcat was the other fighter to see the entire Pacific War through, right next to its land-based rival, the P-40, and it's frequently claimed that it scored 1,006 air-to-air kills and made 58 aces. However, some accounts place the number of aces as high as 74, citing 26 for the Navy, 48 for the Marines, and not even accounting for the unknown number from the British. Kill ratios are also fairly inconsistent. One source says that by the end of 1942, F4F pilots had accounted for as high as a 9-to-1 kill ratio of the Japanese, while another claims that in total in 1942, the F4F kill-to-loss ratio for air combat was 5.9-to-1, and that for the whole war, the ratio was 6.9-to-1. Then still others claim that the kill ratio in early 1942 was 1.5 Wildcats for every 0, and the total reversed to 5.9-to-1 after the completion of the Guadalcanal campaign in early 1943. It feels like every source I'm looking at has a different number from a different spot on the timeline to where I can't tell whether I'm looking at a truth or a typo. This plane's history was so back and forth, it was like trying to hype up a beginner-level NPC that's both completely unassuming and critically important at the same time. But one thing is absolutely for sure. No matter what the kill counts would be, the Wildcat is one of the most underappreciated fighters of all time, because no matter who it fought on the Axis powers, no matter how well or poorly it would do, one phrase would sum it up better than any other.
I could do this all day.
Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description and now underneath the video in your standard viewing window. And if you want to watch my Twitch streams but can't catch them live, go check out my VOD channel linked up in the corner there. And as always, if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.